Good morning, it's November 27th, and this is to my liberal friends. You know, there used to be a saying that if it's good for General Motors, it's good for the country. Well, that was years ago, before the invasion of foreign autos to compete with the big three, so that adage is no longer really viable. In my opinion, it's been replaced with something that speaks to the housing market. I don't have a catchy phrase, but the issue is one that certainly is having an impact on the economy and will continue to do so until we find a solution. And let's face it, it's a terrible time to buy a house. There will come a time when that will change, but the bad news is that's not coming very soon. The question was put to several experts, and their basic response is it might take something close to a decade to solve this problem. Well, the problem is twofold. We have a long-standing housing shortage. We have a frozen housing market. The latter is making the former worse, and it will take years for this to even out and ease up. The fundamental issue is that the nation does not have enough homes in the place where people want to live, a consequence of over a decade of underbuilding that began with the recession around 2008. Those same experts put the shortage between 2.3 million and up to 6.5 million homes, depending on who you talk to. But make no mistake, the number's big, and the result is the cost of housing is spiraling upward both for buyers and for renters. So how did we get to this point? During the pandemic, the Federal Reserve continued to reduce interest rates down to nothing for the official rate. That brought the 30-year fixed rate mortgage down to around 3% and sometimes lower. The public went on a buying spree as people scrambled to get a low mortgage rate. That forced prices upward as well. Sellers were suddenly selling and they became buyers themselves. They sold their house and looked for a new one. During the pandemic, many people took advantage of the work-from-home economy and moved to a more desirable place to live. But that had to change eventually. Biden and his fellow Democrats went on a spending spree, increasing deficits and the national debt to record numbers as they tried to funnel government money to the people they decided needed it. And they defined those in need of help very generously. Basically, if you made under $400,000, they were going to get you pandemic money. That leads to a situation where there's too much money chasing too few goods. The result is inflation that ultimately soared to just about 9% and forced the Federal Reserve to finally step in and start acting like an adult. They started raising interest rates to cool off the economy, and that led to mortgage rates surging higher as well. This led to a huge run-up in mortgage rates and a crash in home sales. Would-be buyers decided to rent instead of buy. Would-be sellers decided to stay put instead of moving because why give up a 3% mortgage rate for a 7% mortgage rate? Very few units hit the market, so prices stayed high. And since people were renting, rents went up. This is the uncomfortable equilibrium of the market finds itself in today. Nobody's selling because nobody's buying. Nobody's buying because nobody's selling. Nobody can afford to sell. Nobody can afford to buy. Prices are high. Mortgage costs are high. Rents are high too. There's not a huge amount of rental inventory. Everyone's stuck and paying more than they want to. And this is the part of Bidenomics' message that the Biden team does not get. Inflation may be coming down as a result of the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates, but the cost of goods and services remains much higher than it was before Biden came into office. Over and over, the White House and their allies in the media keep trying to tell the voting public they're better off under Biden. But the voters are the ones paying the higher prices, and they're not buying that story. And if the housing starts fall, it has a roll-through effect in the economy. They won't be selling the things it needs to take to build a house: concrete, lumber, roofing, sheetrock, and windows. They won't be buying HVAC equipment, carpet, tile, cabinets, and all the things it takes to build a house. And if people cannot afford to buy the house because inflation has driven up the cost of a house, then all these other businesses will ultimately suffer. So last week, the White House posted about inflation on X, formerly known as Twitter, which is what everybody says now. Quote, ahead of the holiday season, costs are down for everything from airline tickets and car rentals to toys and TVs, end quote. Well, Biden and his underlings continue to believe public disapproval of this disastrous economic performance can be improved with happy talk and cherry-picked statistics. It assumes Americans can't remember how much less the cost of living was when Biden was elected. They continue to insult the voters because they're so out of tune they actually think their selling should be bought by the voters. What the voters see is that regular unleaded gasoline they buy to fuel up on the way will be on average 70% more expensive than it was 3 years ago. And the food. Well, for Thanksgiving, turkey costs about 30% more than it did the month Biden was elected. Rolls, butters, cranberry sauce, desserts are up by 27, 25, 23, and 30% respectively. Few voters will find much to celebrate with that. Yet after the recent Consumer Price Index report, Joe Biden took a victory lap. And I'm going to quote him. Today we saw more progress bringing down inflation while maintaining one of the strongest job markets in history. At 3.2%, annual inflation is down by 65% from the peak. Gas prices are below $3.40 per gallon, reflecting an average decline of $1.65 from the peak after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Inflation has come down while the unemployment rate has been below 4% for 20 months in a row, the longest stretch in more than 50 years, while wages, wealth, and share of working age Americans with jobs are all higher now than before the pandemic. End quote. This interpretation of the CPI report is so profoundly dishonest. The 3.2% inflation rate is nearly 3 times the 1.2% it was that Biden inherited. It's down 65% only because the Biden administration let it skyrocket to over 9% before it attempted to get it under control. That gas is below $3.40 hardly compares well to the national average of $2.11 that prevailed when Biden was elected. As to wages, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that average hourly earnings, adjusted for inflation, for all employees stood at $11.05 in October, down from $11.10 in March of 2020, when the lockdown lunacy began. And still the liberals in the media wonder why Biden is trailing Trump in the polls. It's because they cannot be honest with themselves and have to admit that Bidenomics is a failure. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.